Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something that, well, might not seem super exciting at first glance, but it's seriously important. We're talking all about rent receipts.
Yeah, rent receipts. I know, not exactly the most glamorous topic, but trust me, these little pieces of paper can save you a ton of trouble down the road. We're going to be going deep on this episode from the Landlord Files podcast. It's called The Importance of Rent Receipts, and it is jam-packed with info you do not want to miss.
Yeah, it's funny because most people don't think twice about rent receipts until they're in a situation where they desperately need one. It's kind of like insurance. You hope you never have to use it, but when you do, you're really glad you have it.
That's a great analogy. So let's break down why these receipts are so crucial. The podcast episode gives 4 main reasons, and the first one is pretty obvious: proof of payment. If your landlord ever tries to say you missed a payment, boom, that receipt just shuts down that argument right away. Exactly. It's all about having that clear evidence. Imagine, you're in a rent-controlled area, where the government limits how much landlords can increase the rent. Well, without receipts showing your payment history, a landlord could try to sneakily raise the rent more than they're allowed to when a new tenant moves in. Having those receipts basically gives you the power to hold them accountable.
Makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second reason is something I've always wondered about. Tax benefits. I know homeowners can deduct mortgage interest and all that, but what about us renters? Can we get any tax breaks?
Actually, yeah, in certain cases, you can claim part of your rent as a business expense. This is especially true if you're self-employed and you use a part of your home as a workspace. But, and this is important, you gotta have solid documentation to back up those deductions. And guess what? Rent receipts are your best friend here.
So it's not just about avoiding issues with your landlord. It's also about potentially saving some money when tax season rolls around. Okay, reason number 3. I've heard that rent receipts can be important when you're applying for things like credit cards or loans. Is there any truth to that?
Absolutely. Put yourself in the shoes of a lender for a sec. They want to see that you're responsible with your money, right? So if you can show them a pattern of consistent on-time rent payments, it shows stability, it shows trustworthiness. Those receipts can actually help you build up your creditworthiness, especially if you don't have a super long credit history.
It's like those receipts are little building blocks for a strong financial foundation. Okay, last but not least, the podcast talks about legal protection. Now, that sounds a bit scary. Can you shed some light on what that means exactly?
Think of it as protecting yourself from potentially unfair situations. Let's say your landlord tries to claim you owe back rent, even though you know you've paid everything on time. A well-kept rent receipt is like your ultimate shield. It proves you held up your end of the deal. It's like having a legal guardian angel watching over you.
Wow, I'm starting to see that these little slips of paper pack a much bigger punch than I ever realized. Okay, so we know why rent receipts are so important, but what exactly makes a receipt bulletproof? What should we be looking for to make sure it holds up if, things get a little dicey?
There are a few key things that make a receipt really effective. First off, it needs to clearly state your name as the tenant and your landlord's name and contact info.
Okay, pretty basic stuff. What else should we be looking for?
The property address is super important, obviously, and the amount paid needs to be crystal clear, especially if you're paying in cash or making partial payments.
Right, that's where things could get messy. And of course, the date of payment, super important to have that clear timeline of when you paid.
You got it. And here's the kicker. To really make that receipt airtight, it should have the landlord's signature, or at the very least, the signature of someone who's authorized to collect rent on their behalf. That adds legitimacy and makes it a lot harder for anyone to try and dispute the payment.
Now, let's say you've got a landlord who's a little old school and maybe not so keen on providing a formal written receipt. What can you do then?
That's where a little tech knowledge can be your best friend. Even something as simple as an email confirming your payment can be valuable documentation. Just make sure it includes all the essentials we've been talking about: names, addresses, the amount, date, payment method, all that good stuff. And there you have it, a digital receipt that can be just as powerful as a paper one.
It's like having a digital backup, just in case anything gets lost or disputed. This whole conversation actually reminds me of a friend who had a huge disagreement with their landlord a while back. The landlord was claiming they hadn't paid rent for months, but thankfully, my friend had kept every single rent receipt all nicely organized in a folder. Those receipts saved the day. They proved they had been paying on time and managed to avoid a potential eviction.
It just goes to show that those little pieces of paper, they might seem insignificant at the time, but they can seriously be your lifesaver. They give you that concrete proof you need to protect yourself.
Absolutely. So far, we've mostly been looking at things from the tenant's perspective. But what about landlords? Why should they care about keeping good records too? Is it just to cover their backs from potentially difficult tenants, or are there other benefits for them?
It's definitely more than just protection. Accurate records are like a landlord's best friend come tax season. They need to be able to report their rental income correctly, and receipts play a huge role in backing up those figures. It helps them stay organized, avoid any trouble with the IRS, and make sure they're paying their fair share of taxes.
I never thought of it that way. So it sounds like good record keeping is a win-win for both tenants and landlords. It creates transparency, accountability, and just makes the whole renting experience smoother for everyone involved. But let's be real, sometimes things don't go so smoothly. What happens if a landlord straight up refuses to give you a receipt? What can a tenant do in that situation?
That's when it's super important to know your rights as a tenant. In most places, landlords are actually legally required to give you a receipt if you ask for one. So if your landlord is being difficult, the first step is to just politely remind them of their legal obligations.
So it's about arming yourself with a little legal know-how. But what if that doesn't work? What are your options then? And is it even worth the trouble of fighting for that receipt?
It definitely can be. If a friendly reminder doesn't do the trick, you might have to take things up a notch. Reaching out to a local tenants' rights group or even talking to a lawyer can give you some really valuable guidance and support.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of why these receipts are important and what they should look like. But now I'm thinking about those situations where things get a little more complicated, with all these digital payment apps becoming so popular. Do those apps automatically generate receipts that are good enough? Or is there anything else renters should be aware of?
That's a great question, and it leads us to a really interesting discussion about how the whole world of rent payments is changing. We'll dig deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, because next we're exploring the wild world of digital rent receipts and how technology is shaking things up between tenants and landlords. Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up right where we left off, diving into the digital side of rent receipts. These online payment platforms and apps are everywhere these days. Super convenient, but I've always wondered, do they automatically give you those receipts that actually hold up, legally speaking? Or is there more to it than that?
That's a really good question. It really shows how technology is changing the whole renting game. Most of those well-known platforms do generate receipts automatically, but it's always a good idea to, double check just to be safe. Make sure those digital receipts have all those essential elements we talked about earlier: names, addresses, dates, the amount, and ideally some kind of confirmation from the landlord, just to be extra sure.
So it's like those platforms give you a good starting point, but you still got to be on top of it and make sure those receipts are rock solid, just in case.
Exactly. And here's where things get interesting, because with digital receipts, you also got to think about the platform's security and how reliable it is. You want to make sure the company is legit, that they use good encryption to protect your financial info, and that they have a good track record when it comes to accuracy and keeping things secure.
So it's kind of like when you're choosing a bank. You wouldn't just trust any random app with your money, right?
Yeah.
You want to do your research and make sure it's a trustworthy institution.
Exactly. And when we're talking digital rent receipts, you want to be sure that the platform has clear policies about how they store your data, who has access to it, and what happens if the company goes belly up or, there's a data breach.
Now that you mentioned data breaches, it makes me think about privacy and digital security in general. I know landlords have to keep physical rent receipts confidential. But what about all those digital records? Are there any laws or regulations that protect tenants' information in the digital world?
That's a really important question, and honestly, the answer kind of depends on where you live. Data privacy laws are always changing. It's like a moving target, so it's super important to understand the specific regulations in your area. Some places have really strict rules about how landlords can store and handle tenants' personal info, even in digital form.
So it's like the same principles of privacy and confidentiality should apply to digital records just as much as they do to physical documents.
Absolutely. And it's so important for tenants to know their rights and to stand up for their privacy, especially in this digital age. Don't be afraid to ask your landlord about their data security practices and how they're protecting your information.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the legal side of things and the practical stuff, but I want to switch gears a bit and talk about the human element. How can keeping good records, whether they're digital or paper, help create a healthier relationship between tenants and landlords? It seems like it goes deeper than just avoiding those disagreements.
You're totally right. It's all about building trust and being transparent with each other. When both sides are diligent about keeping good documentation, it creates the shared understanding of the agreement. It's less about he said, she said, and more about here's the proof, black and white.
It's like having that clear record that everyone can refer back to, which can help prevent misunderstandings and even create more mutual respect.
Exactly. And when you have that foundation of trust, it makes it easier to communicate openly. If a tenant feels confident that their landlord is organized and on top of things, they're more likely to feel comfortable bringing up any issues or concerns.
And on the flip side, if a landlord knows that a tenant is responsible and keeps good records, they're more likely to be understanding and flexible if, payment is a little late or something unexpected happens.
It's about creating a sense of partnership instead of feeling like you're on opposite sides. And clear documentation is a powerful tool for building that kind of positive relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like when you're dealing with a friend or a family member. If you have a history of open communication and trust, you're more likely to work through challenges together. So, in a way, could good record keeping actually bring tenants and landlords closer?
Yeah, I think so. It creates a sense of shared responsibility, and accountability, which can make the whole living experience better and more harmonious for everyone.
That's a really interesting perspective. So far, we've been focusing on the financial and legal perks of rent receipts. But this conversation has me thinking about, some bigger implications. What about the role of documentation in creating a more fair and just housing system overall?
That's a great point, and it's definitely something worth exploring further. Documentation can be a powerful way to give tenants more power and hold landlords accountable for fair and ethical practices. We'll dive into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, folks, because things are about to get even more thought-provoking. All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive on rent receipts. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nitty-gritty of what makes a receipt hold up in court to those surprising ways documentation can actually make the whole tenant-landlord relationship better. But now I want to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. We talked about this move towards digital payments and all that. But what does that mean for fairness and equity in housing? Is technology making things more level, or could it actually create some new problems?
That's a really important question, and it really gets to the heart of how technology can either, strengthen or disrupt the power dynamics that already exist. On one hand, digital tools can be really empowering for tenants. It gives them easier access to information, resources, even legal support. Think about those online platforms that provide templates for lease agreements or connect renters with tenant rights groups. Those tools can really help level the playing field, especially for people who might not have a ton of time or resources or even the know-how to navigate all those complicated legal processes on their own.
So it's like technology can give tenants a voice and a way to advocate for themselves more effectively.
Exactly. And it can also make the whole rental market more transparent and hold landlords more accountable. Online reviews and ratings of landlords can really expose unfair practices and help tenants make smarter choices about where they're going to live.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about folks who might not be super comfortable with technology or don't have reliable access to the internet. Could this shift towards digital documentation actually create a new digital divide where some renters get left behind?
That's a really valid concern, and we definitely need to be careful about that. This move to a digital world shouldn't come at the expense of people who aren't as tech savvy or who have trouble accessing technology. It's really important to make sure that information and resources are available in different formats and languages, and that there are support systems in place to help people who need it.
So it's not just about developing new tech, it's about making sure the tech is inclusive and accessible to everyone, right?
Exactly. We have to be intentional about designing systems that are fair and easy for everyone to use.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. I mean, we started out talking about rent receipts, these little pieces of paper that most of us don't think twice about. But they can actually be a reflection of bigger social and economic issues. It's not just about keeping track of payments. It's about power dynamics. It's about access to information and making sure there's fairness in a system that can sometimes feel really stacked against renters.
You said it perfectly. It really highlights how important it is to be informed, to know your rights, and to fight for a housing system that's more fair and just for everyone.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We went from thinking about rent receipts as just those annoying little slips of paper to understanding how crucial they are for protecting tenants, making things transparent, and even shaping the future of housing.
It's amazing how something that seems so ordinary can spark such a fascinating and complex conversation, right?
Totally. I know I'll never look at a rent receipt the same way again. And to all our listeners out there, remember, knowledge is power. Even those little pieces of paper can be powerful tools for making sure you're treated fairly and making the world a bit more just for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those receipts handy.
If this podcast helped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep making these videos. Thanks for watching.